Welcome to the Life Unscripted podcast. I'm Alix Kendall. This episode is titled Blind Ambition, and here's why. This guy, Corbb O'Connor. Now, you may not know his name, but he is a leader in the blind community. He was appointed by Governor Walz, and he serves on the State Rehab Council for the Blind. He's president of the National Federation of the Blind Minnesota, and he's the director of accessibility advocacy for State Services of the Blind. He's also a recovering journalist and occasional cowboy. He's busy, and he is blind. So my first question, how does he get around, and how did he get to the studio today?
Well, it's straightforward for me. Live just a few miles here from the studio, and for me, it's just a matter of grabbing an Uber. And the thing that I think about a lot when I think about rideshare is that, a year ago we would have been having a very different conversation about rideshare in the Twin Cities. There was a lot of debate as to whether Uber and Lyft were going to stay in the Twin Cities, and a lot of discussion about how do we pay drivers and what are the state responsibilities, the local responsibilities, and super grateful that, our organization in the National Federation of the Blind got together and said, you know what, we need to get everybody to the table. And certainly we're not the only group that brought light to the issue, but we certainly were one of them, saying we've got to have affordable transportation for blind folks and all people with disabilities, and we've got to make sure that it's accessible as well.
Were you blind from birth?
I was. Yeah, born blind. So, I've lost some vision over the years, but really grateful to have had parents who said, you're going to do things differently from everybody else, but you're still going to do the same things that everyone else can do. I remember growing up, right, I would say, I want to be they said, what do you want to be when you grow up? Everyone asks everyone that question, right? And I would say, I want to be a bus driver. And they'd be like, great, go be a bus driver. And nobody said, you're going to be a bus driver. You're a blind person. Little did they know, right? We'd have self-driving ride shares now,
right.
Years later. But more importantly, right, it was about, no 10-year-old knows what they want to do when they grow up. Blindness doesn't need to be the limiting factor for them. Just it doesn't need to be, reality of whether you can survive as a graphic designer, an artist, a painter, right? Let the 10-year-olds be painters if they want. And let's figure out the details later.
I love that enthusiasm. What was your educational experience like? Describe that a little bit.
So I went to mainstream schools, and went to a Montessori school growing up, and then to I was a out of district public school. And the public school is actually a year-round school. So it was a neat concept. They had a lot of trouble getting enrollment the first year, and then everybody saw what a great idea it was. It was different from everybody else growing up because I had, 12 weeks of class, 3 weeks off, 12 weeks, 3 weeks off. We had a 6-week summer. But as a result, we spent a lot of time together. But from a braille and cane travel perspective, they were things that I learned growing up. So I would have teachers come into the classroom and, we would do some pull-out instruction, learning to use a white cane, travel independently. There was a lot of trips to Mrs. Field's Cookies at the mall. But I think what I regret is that I didn't learn braille as a means of using it in school at the time. It was kind of like, well, if you lose more vision when you're older, here's braille, you could rely back on this. And instead, what I wished I had learned was braille can be just as effective as print. And I probably would have had an easier time in school if I had really learned and used braille rather than learning it at the age of 22.
I've always wondered when I see braille, for instance, at the elevators and various places in public spaces, how does that work? How do you find where the braille is? It seems like it would be difficult, but I guess this is your world versus mine.
Yeah, braille signage there are standards for it, where it is in terms of height and whatnot. And we've gotten to a point where, there's braille on, as you mentioned, elevators, there's braille on ATMs, there's braille on hotel rooms. And I've gotten so used to it that, I went to a stay overseas for work. I went to Denmark and got to my hotel in Copenhagen. I was totally jet lagged. And they said, do you need help to your room? No, I'm fine. I was so used to braille in the elevators, braille. And so I got on the elevator and it was a touchscreen elevator. No. And I thought, oh no. And so the pride got the better of me and I was not going to go back to the front desk and say, can you help me to my room? And they said, okay, all I have to do is get to my right floor, get to the floor and I'll figure it out. Well, Copenhagen didn't have braille on the room numbers either, but easy enough to figure out. They were tactile. They were, I guess, trying to make it pretty, and so they were 3D, and I could feel the room numbers. And your key's only going to work in one door anyway. But yeah, I've just gotten really used to where to look, and really grateful that it's become an architectural standard.
When we first started this conversation, I asked you about, getting here. And I think about you have a son, and just getting out the door with children is hard to begin with for people who have sight. And your son is blind. Can you describe a little bit about, maybe some of the challenges that you face?
I think that the challenges I face as a blind parent are not that different from any other parent. I think where things could be different for blind parents is when you don't have the skills and the training on how to live independently and how to use non-visual skills. So the National Federation of the Blind of Minnesota last year passed legislation that protects the rights of parents with disabilities here in Minnesota that says, hey, if there's going to be a discussion about whether this person is a fit parent, we've seen blind parents in hospitals, right, be brought to a social worker, and the social worker says, we don't think you can be, a safe parent for this kid. And, kid in Missouri was taken from his parents for several weeks right after he was born. And we wanted to make sure that didn't happen here in Minnesota. And so it's those kinds of attitudes that are probably the worst part of blind parenting. And it's really about education, both of the medical staff, the human services staff, but also just of people around in the community. And, people will sometimes say to my son, oh, you're such a big help to your dad. I'm like, yeah, he made his bed this morning. That was a big help, right? He got his stuff off the floor. He made his snack. Not that I can't do any of those things, but, I was busy.
That's right.
It's time for him to learn something. That's really the biggest challenge, more so than anything, practically, of how do you give medicine and know if he has a fever, know if he has a rash, those kinds of things that every parent deals with.
So if we see someone out there who is blind, what is would you say, the right way to guide someone who is blind, or to approach someone who is blind? I think that there are some things that are not helpful, right?
Well, I think the first thing is as we do so well here in Minnesota, right, the best way to greet a blind person is to say hello. And so often I think that we as folks jump to kind of a medical model of disability. I talked about this with some coworkers yesterday, and I challenged them. I said, you see a blind person in the airport, and what do you do? And some of them, had different answers to that question. I said, all right, you see a blind person in the airport walking toward an escalator. What do you do? You see a blind person walking in an airport toward an escalator that's going the wrong way. And eventually everybody says, oh, I would reach out and I'd say, hey, be careful, or can I help you, or you look lost. And I said, really, if that blind person is traveling confidently with a white cane or a guide dog, that isn't the first escalator they've come to in their life. And they're going to know how to look for, is this going the right way? Is this where I want to be going? And certainly, right, if somebody looks lost in an airport and you know that airport forward, backward, and upside down, by all means, right? We do that for anybody. It's not because that person is blind or uses a wheelchair that I'm going to ask if they need help. It's because that's just who I am, right? And so I think that's the most important part. And then sometimes it's about, just if a blind person asks for information, just providing that information. Or if they decline help, okay, right? And I think a lot of times it's, do you need help? No, I'm good. Are you sure? Yes, I am quite sure. Right? Or, hey, what street is this? Oh, where are you trying to go? No. I asked you what street this was. I know where I'm going. I'm just confirming, right? And so I think it's about providing that information from a mindset of, this person is going to do and live independently and live the life that they want. And maybe I can provide some information along the way, or maybe I could just say hello.
So saying watch out, that is not a good thing to do, because they know what they're doing out there. And if they look confused and everybody gets confused, I get lost in airports. So just give blind people the benefit of the doubt, obviously, and just treat them like humans first and foremost. And if you need help, you'll ask for it.
Yeah, and I would say that, when it comes to the watch out piece, right, it's always interesting because our white canes are designed to bump into things. It's what the white cane's job is. The white cane hits stuff so I don't. Whether it's a small child or a camera or, a sign in an airport, usually people panic that my cane is going to hit something about 2 inches before my cane would tell me. And so the screaming of watch out, right? And makes me panic and, freeze up and right as it would anybody. And really all it would be is a slight tap of my cane. My cane's not dangerous enough to hurt anyone. So, it's that contact that's really important for a cane to give us the information of what's in this environment. Is it ice? Is it snow? Is it concrete? Is it a wall? Our canes can tell us a lot of things, but for that to happen, they have to make contact with it, whatever that is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, you are an advocate for the blind, and when did you decide to take an active role as being an advocate?
I think that I learned the skills of advocacy from my parents growing up. So when I was in the school system, we had IEP meetings, individualized education plans. And this is a agreement with the school and the parents that says, here are the services, here are the accommodations we're going to provide to this kid with a disability. And for me, I grew up with, fortunately, with that in place. But it was my parents who started bringing me to those meetings when I was in kindergarten. And I didn't know this at the time, but there's always a large group of people. There's like a dozen people at these meetings. And I, as a young kid, was just sitting there and there was somebody, this is, early 1990s, typing on a laptop. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And so this person, it turns out, had been fighting with my parents nicely, but saying, we're not going to provide the services your kid needs in this Montessori school. Instead, he can wake up at 6 a.m. and you can drive him to a public school and we'll give him braille services there. And then you can drive him back to his school. My parents said, no, he goes to school here. You can provide the services here. What's the difference if a teacher drives to your school or this school? I didn't know any of this background. But I just saw this laptop, thought this was really neat. And I asked this lady, I said, can I sit in your lap while you're typing? and my parents tell the story to say that they finally came to her. They were having this discussion back and forth and people looked at her and said, so what's the decision? And she looked up from talking to me and goes, what? Huh? It's fine. Whatever they want. And so I guess at that point was when I became an advocate. I didn't really even know what I was doing. I just, was enjoying some cool technology. But most importantly, my parents brought me to those IEP meetings from then on all the way until I graduated high school. And so I think I learned those skills of self-advocacy through those meetings, but also through, teachers and living in the world and saying, there's not always, a sighted person in your pocket that you can rely on. So what are you going to do when you need something? Well, you're going to advocate for yourself. And here's how to do that.
Let's talk about employment opportunities and education. How are things going here in Minnesota? As far as a grade, how would you say we're doing?
A grade. I think that it's what I've observed about Minnesota is that we have a lot of the legal places in place to make this possible. So we have, all the laws that protect against non-discrimination. We have programs that like the Connect 700 program in Minnesota that helps get more people with disabilities into state government jobs. We even have a fund administered by State Services for the Blind for anyone with a disability in Minnesota. It's the Employer Reasonable Accommodations Fund, or ERAF, that will reimburse the cost of assistive technology for employees with disabilities. So we have a lot of great things in place. And where we still struggle is that we find applications for jobs that say a driver's license is required, right? And we say, no, a driver's license isn't required. Maybe you need to be able to get to your clients' homes. You need to be able to travel. Maybe that means that the state needs to provide a driver. Maybe it means you're going to use Uber and Lyft. Maybe it means public transportation. And sometimes it just means we need to identify you as the employee. Well, that doesn't require a driver's license, but that's one of those things that we continue to see on job applications, as well as maybe some of those that we see across the country. And that's just people's misunderstandings of the capabilities of blind folks. So, grade-wise, I guess maybe somewhere between a C and a B, but really what I'm excited by in Minnesota is that we do have some really great organizations that are helping blind folks understand that blindness doesn't have to define who they are or their future, that they can really live the life that they want and they can have the job that they want. And we can, in the National Federation of the Blind, for example, provide the networking and opportunities for them to learn what those careers are all about. Okay, so Minnesota's doing pretty well. Mm-hmm. If you can step back and look at the country,
how would you say nationally across the board as far as helping people with, who have low vision, blindness, or just any disability? What would you like to see?
We, as the National Federation of the Blind, have joined with several other advocacy organizations in saying that, a lot of the work that the current administration is doing at the presidential level from the Department of Government Efficiency has really been a challenge for a lot of people with disabilities, including blind folks. So, we have filed a lawsuit against the Social Security Administration because what we've seen is that you're requiring more people to go in person to get these life-saving services that they need, these services that help them to get health care, that also help them to bridge the gap in employment at times. You're requiring them to go in person while you're eliminating local offices, while you're eliminating staff. So you're requiring more of the people who need the service and providing less. And so I think when we look at programs like that at the national level, we really get concerned about what opportunities are there for blind people to get ahead. But then we also see, places where blind folks are denied the opportunities of other folks. In some cases, that's about being a juror. We've seen some states, systematically discriminating against blind people from serving on juries because the thought is we can't examine evidence. Well, there's lots of ways we can examine evidence. We've had blind lawyers for a really long time. We look at colleges that say it's unsafe for a blind person to be in our science labs because they have a disability. They need to have an able-bodied person with them. So I think nationally we have a lot of ableism that is really preventing blind folks from being able to just focus on living a productive life and enjoying what it is that they've set out to do. But I don't think that the future is entirely bleak. We do have some great organizations that are out there providing opportunities for people with disabilities to get education, to get workforce training, and to get an advanced training. So for me, right, being somebody who's hired and supervised employees and now rising to the role of director in my day job, right, I think that it's not impossible, but there are certainly a lot of barriers in the way that make it really challenging for people who don't have access to that education and training.
Yep. Money and federal funding, we know, is diminishing, or at least they're threatening to diminish it. Some of it has already happened. Yeah. And I'm sure you're concerned about that. And what about housing? Encouraging and being independent is really important for people who are blind, who have low vision.
It is. And, I think in Minnesota, we as an organization, we were founded in 1920, the National Federation of the Blind of Minnesota, during another pandemic. And we quickly found that housing was actually one of the first struggles that our organization worked on, was making sure that landlords would rent to blind people. And when they wouldn't, we started our own home for the blind. And, it became less necessary as we got into the 80s because more landlords there were more legal protections and it really wasn't an issue. And so we said, you know what? Okay, we've not to say we've solved that issue, but we've addressed it. Let's instead look for what's the next opportunity. Well, there's not great training for blind people in how to live independently, non-visually. And so we had been working with state agencies since World War II to make that training better. And when we couldn't find it, we said, you know what, we're going to build our own. And we built one here in Minnesota. There was one in Louisiana, opened the same day. And we've been providing that training here at the Minnesota Center for the Blind for many years. And that's really about teaching people cane travel, assistive technology, braille, but also the skills of daily living, from cleaning to cooking. And that's a lot of what we find blind seniors are needing today, is that they want to live independently. They're losing their vision, and they don't necessarily always have access to know how to do those things like cooking or cleaning or entertaining. And those are the skills that we're teaching to folks.
Let's move on to driverless cars. We know Waymo's has been involved with the National Federation of the Blind,
Yep.
kind of working to develop and refine accessible features for self-driving cars. So have you been in one yet?
I had the chance to take a self-driving Waymo in San Francisco about a year ago. And it was both exciting and terrifying. What I think is Waymo's done some really interesting work on is it's one thing to build a self-driving car and say, oh, okay, well, of course blind people can use it. They don't have to drive it. But there's so much technology between the desire to want to go somewhere and getting out of the vehicle when you get there. And I think what Waymo's done is proven that when you work with blind people in the organized blind movement, as we build out that technology, we find things like, well, how do you find the car? How do you request the car? Well, you request the car with an app that can be used with the accessibility features built into every iPhone and Android device. Well, okay, how do I know it's my car? Well, what if we had a button where you could honk the horn? What if instead of having to cross that 4-lane road to get to your car, what if there was a button that said, can you come around the corner to meet me on this side of the street? Hey, when I get in the car, there's a device that's a tablet in the car. Maybe I want to use my phone. Maybe I want to use that tablet. Can we make sure that's usable by folks who are blind, deafblind, and have low vision? Like those are all the other pieces to not just the driving of the car, but how we interact with that technology. And it was pretty fun, right? It was interesting for me. I left my hotel. I met the car. I went across town, and I tell you, it making left turns from one ways to one ways on red lights and using part of the parking lane to make its left turn, terrifying. Perfectly normal, but terrifying. But what was interesting to me is I got out of the car at this restaurant. I went across town to get this really good fried chicken, so people told me. And I got out, and I was so excited for this fried chicken. I walked in, and there's a 12-inch tablet on the counter. And all the employees are working in the kitchen. There's nobody to ask for ordering except this inaccessible tablet. And it was just so interesting to me. I literally drove across the city of San Francisco without the need for anyone else, including not even a driver. And I can't order a chicken sandwich.
That's just wrong.
Right. And it's like we made the technology work in so many ways. When we think about and incorporate digital accessibility, it's a legal requirement, but it also is something that we have to think about with our design and development teams.
All right. So you are a tech nerd.
I am.
And I'm going to let you geek out a little bit now. Let's talk about your skills when it comes to technology. We've had a little bit of that
Sure.
from this conversation. But, you've been involved in computers and everything for a long time.
I have. It was 1996 when I got my first domain name. And what better way to build a website than to build a website to teach other people how to build sites? So I created justforwebmasters.com. I should have held on to it, but I gave it up a while ago. So I started building websites with Photoshop, with Netscape back in the day, and really have just kind of continued that. And so today, I work to help folks who are designing and building websites, mobile apps, kiosks, to make sure that those are usable by folks with disabilities using maybe it's enlarged print, maybe it's changing the contrast on the screen, or maybe it's taking what's on the screen and reading it aloud through a screen reader. Those are all technologies that blind folks are bringing to these sites, to the experiences, and we just need to make sure that those experiences are accessible enough to work for them.
So 1 in 5 users, internet users, has a disability. And you think about it from a business perspective, that's 20% of, visitors to your website. And if you have their business, if you show commitment, and digital equality on top of all of that, you should do it to begin with, but also cha-ching, you can make some more money when you think about it that way.
I agree. And, there are many online retailers that I can shop at. I know that I pay a premium to get some things delivered from Target that I could get cheaper on Amazon. But Target has invested in accessibility to the point that I know I can quickly use the app, compare, read reviews, sort, filter, and get it shipped to me, and might even take an extra few days than what Amazon could do. Because it's accessible, I'm willing to pay a premium for that, and I'm willing to make that choice. I'm a much more loyal Target customer than I am to anyone else. I'm going to look at Target first because I know it's accessible. With, Utah State University has been studying the accessibility of the internet for a long time, and they have found that 96% of the top million homepages have accessibility barriers that stop someone from using them with assistive technology. And so why take my chances with some new vendor when I know Target's good? If they have what I need, great. It's done. I can move on with the rest of my day. Still use Amazon, unfortunately. It's just a lot harder of an experience.
But Target, we know, has been in the news because they were one of the earlier embracers of getting rid of their DEI programs. And have you noticed any difference in the kind of quality of just maneuvering, ordering something from Target?
I think we have to separate. I have not, and I think that's because we need to separate the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion from digital accessibility. Whereas, and I'm a big supporter of DEI. I think it's important that we bring in less viewpoints of white dudes and bring in more diverse experiences. But I also know that digital accessibility is legally required, and it's a sense that these are rights of people to have access, to have privacy and security in how they're doing their shopping. And that's different from maybe how we think about employment practices and affirmative action and the creation of resources that we want to be attracting of different customer base. I think both are important, but digital accessibility and DEI to me are separable concepts. And again, I think we need to have both, but in an environment that doesn't support this diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think we have to remember that digital accessibility is definitely here to stay.
I want to get into your journalism background now. You're a recovering journalist, as am I. Tell me about how you got into that. Was it through college?
I got into journalism in high school. So I wanted to work on our radio station. We had an FM radio station in my high school, which I'm super excited to tell you was a station managed by my brother before they even had an FCC license. And he did a lot of that initial paperwork to get the FM license. And I ended up taking a class in journalism and then ended up joining the yearbook staff. And our yearbook was very much focused on magazine-style journalism. So I did that for several years in high school, and that was very much something that intrigued me. I went to school in D.C. for college, interned in a few journalism institutions, NBC News, Marketplace, Public Radio, and for me, I just loved being able to help tell somebody's stories. And you asked about my roots in advocacy, and I think that's where the two kind of came together. Is journalists can't have opinions, they can't advocate for causes. What's the number one thing you don't do? You don't sign petitions. And right as I graduated college, we in the National Federation of the Blind were pushing then, as we have been since 1938 and continue to do today, to end subminimum wages for workers with disabilities. To say, if you have a disability in the U.S., it's still legal for some of them to be paid less than minimum wage. And so the petition went around. We were going to send it to the White House. And it got to me, and I wanted so badly to sign it. But I thought, I want a job in journalism in a few months. I can't do that. And it pained me so much that I said, you know what? What's more important to me is advocacy. And you know what? If I have a job where I can't have an opinion, it's probably not the right job for me. And so that's really what kind of pushed me away from journalism, but definitely still get to do a lot of the communications and marketing that I've really enjoyed about journalism.
I get that. I really do. Having a job without an opinion, it's difficult, and that's why I'm podcasting. No, not completely, but
for sure. Yeah, I understand.
Okay, so you recovering journalist, and also, what is the cowboy? So you enjoy being a cowboy part time? You like to get on a horse?
So about 15 years ago, my dad came to my brother and I for Christmas, and he said, I have more airline miles than I know what to do with. Tell you what, I would like to take you and your brother for a week anywhere in the world American Airlines flies. And my brother was smart. He found the most far-flung place and said, Hong Kong. I said, I think we should go horseback riding. And he said, okay, go find some places where we can do some horseback riding. Found a dude ranch. Turns out it's the same dude ranch that his dad took him to. I had no idea. Same ranch that his dad took him to when he was a kid in Arizona. And we had such a great time for that first week. And we've been going back horseback riding every year pretty much since then. And so, we by no stretch are fantastic, but by Thursday of a week, we do pretty well on a horse. And I tell you that, for spending as much of my time as I do staring at Zoom and project managing, there's no project management on a horse. And that's, I think, what I love about it is just being in nature, being kind of one with, my son calls them majestic animals, and really getting then to drive cattle. I mean, that's fun, right? Something different.
I like your adventurous spirit. and all the work you're doing for the blind community. Corbb O'Connor, it is a pleasure to finally meet you and have you here in the studio.
Thank you.